Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am doing part 2 of my all about powders, which I initially didn't know that I was going to do, but I had so many comments on my first one asking that I show exactly how I apply each type of powder that I talked about in my initial all about powders video. Ask and you shall receive. I'm going to go through powder foundation, setting powder, under eye setting, and buffing, and even touch up in this video and show you how I apply all of those powders and give you some tips and tricks along the way that will hopefully make it easier the next time you pull out your powders for your makeup look. So if you want to see how I use all of them, let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's begin. I need to set my under eyes first because so far I have on a corrector. I use the Fit Glow corrector. I have on the new, and yes, there will be a review coming very soon, of the Jane Iredale Hydra Pure Tinted Serum. And then for my concealer, I have on the Chantecaille Future Skin Gel Foundation, which I absolutely adore using as a concealer. So at this point in my routine, I would set my under eyes. I talked about a lot of different powders that I like for setting my under eyes. In that other video, I'm going to be using my Ilia Soft Focus Fade Into You powder for the purpose of this video. Now, there are two main ways, in my opinion, that you can set your under eyes. Before I do either one of those, I need to go in and make sure I don't have any creases that has set in since I have done my concealer. This is especially important if you do like I do a lot of times and leave my liquid products to kind of sink into the skin while I do my eyes and then come back and set. That has given it enough time to create creases if it's going to. You obviously don't want to set those creases into place. So making sure you buff them out is essential. Let me get my hair back for y'all. My favorite brush to do that is any kind of fluffy eyeshadow brush, something small enough to really get into the area where your concealer creases the most. I love the BK Beauty 201 brush, and I simply just take it and buff right underneath that lash line just to get that excess product out and help with any future creasing throughout the day. Now let's start with the way I typically set my under eyes, and that is with a brush. My favorite go-to brush is the Wayne Goss number 2. This is a very soft, small detailed brush. Another one that is great is the BK Beauty 108 brush. Very similar in size. I have just always used the Wayne Goss, and it's just what I reach for every day. So I put some powder on, I tap it off. You can fling it wherever you want to tap it off, but you do want to make sure that excess powder is not on the brush. If there is a place on our face where we do not want a ton of product, it is most definitely the under eyes. No matter our age, we have fine lines. As we get older, we have more. If you put a lot of product, it's just asking for the product to sink into those fine lines because it has nowhere else to go. So really make sure you dust that powder off. And then I am simply going to press it under my eyes. So I'm going to start right here in like the hollow, and I'm going to stamp it and then go all the way up and then come back. Really make sure every bit of powder is off the brush. Fine to do because we tap that excess powder off, so we know it's not too much. But you notice I didn't go like this. I don't buff any kind of powder under my eyes because that is only going to disrupt the concealer underneath. It's going to pick up the product. Doing it this way ensures that nothing moves. All the work we put into it, applying the concealer, is going to be the same after we set it as before we set it. If I buffed it, that would not be the case. You can see how much smoother this side is than this. It's more matte too because we put a powder on it. Even if it was a luminous powder, it would take down the shine just a little bit because of the formulas of a powder versus a cream or liquid. Very, very smooth. Now, the other way that you can set is using a powder puff. And I know this is like a big thing now. I don't know, I don't do TikTok, so I don't know if it's all over TikTok, but I feel like everybody's talking about it now, so it's gotta be somewhere. But powder puffs are not a new thing. I've had them in my kit for years and years and years, and they do serve a very nice purpose of really smoothing out any texture and making sure that area is flawless. And it's really pretty simple. I love these. They're small. You can get them on Amazon. That corner fits right up into the corner of your eye. And these are the specific ones that I use in my kit. They're very affordable. I'm just going to put the powder on that. You can tap off any excess. Some is coming off. I'm basically going to do the same exact thing with a puff as I did with the brush. There's not going to be any swiping. It's going to be pressing the product in. So I'm going to take it just like I did the brush. Press, 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 all the way up. Now, if you are someone who likes to bake the under eyes, make sure there's a lot of product under there to maybe keep any fallout from getting onto your face if you've already done your foundation. There's many reasons people choose to bake. Then you would put a lot more powder on the powder puff to where when you pick the powder puff off your face, you see a lot of that powder. And then you dust it off with a brush. I really like, and please don't ask me why I choose to set it with a brush on myself and powder puff my clients. I don't know. They both work, but that is two ways that you could set your under eyes for a very nice, smooth finish. Now let's go to the setting powders for the face. Now what I have done is I have chosen to use a powder foundation because I want to show you how to apply a powder foundation, at least how I like to apply it, but also how you can use a powder foundation for setting and ways that you can do that. So this is the Jane Iredale Pure Pressed Base, which obviously is a favorite of mine. And while this particular foundation is best used, in my opinion, with the handy brush that Jane markets to go with it, I'm not going to use that today because I know not everybody has this powder foundation. Not everybody has that brush. And so I want to show you how it can be done without it. So I am just using, I have no idea. This is a BH Cosmetics brush. This is another great one to use, the Real Techniques powder brush. It's one of my favorites for powder foundation. If you want something to have less coverage, a powder foundation, then you're going to want to go with something fluffier like this. If you want a denser coverage, you're going to go for a denser brush, which this is still a little bit fluffy, but it is a little bit denser than the Real Techniques. There are some loose powder foundations where I know you have probably seen to always buff them in. That can be the case a lot of times for loose powder foundations, but not all the time. And I prefer overall a pressed powder foundation. In that case, I really load the brush up with the product, tap it off. Now, Jane Iredale in particular is meant to be applied going in a downward motion on the face. Okay, you can do that. I kind of go sideways on the forehead. You see how pretty that is? With all powder foundations, another way I love to apply them is the same way we applied the powder under our eyes, and that is by stippling it. There is very little, except for the buffing technique that I will show you, where I don't stipple a product on. I like to stipple my blush. I like to stipple my bronzer. I like to stipple my powder. I like to stipple my foundation. I feel like it gives a more flawless finish. And basically, stippling is stamping. Okay, it's just pressing the product in, picking up the brush, moving on to another area, pressing it in, on and on and on. So if you have any more, like I don't need any more coverage, that is very flawless, but if you have an area where you do and you're working with a powder foundation, I like to then take it and just like I said, stipple, stamp into the area where you want a little bit more coverage. So see this side and how it's just smooth and almost filtered, like where this side is definitely more hydrated looking because we haven't set it down with anything. And it definitely doesn't have as much coverage as when I used the powder foundation. Now, if you want to use the powder foundation as a setting powder, which I often do, and you can, there is no reason you have to go out and buy a setting powder and a powder foundation and this and that. You can multi-use a product for different things. This technique that I'm going to show you is the same exact technique I would use with a loose powder. It's the same one I would use with a pressed powder. And it's very, very simple. It is basically picking a fluffy brush and doing this second step that I did with the powder foundation, and that is simply stippling the powder into the skin. Taking it on a fluffy brush and just tap it in. Again, the same exact thing that I would do any of the pressed or loose powders that I talked about in that other video. There is really no right or wrong way to apply a face powder. except that I just don't recommend going in straight on top of a foundation and buffing a powder into the skin. All that is going to do is move the foundation that you had applied. It is going to cause streaks, and it is going to cause an uneven, patchy application, and you're not likely going to enjoy the end result. So the main takeaway that I want you to get as far as setting powders is stipple, don't buff. That's like my main tip. Really my main tip on everything, but just pat it into the skin. So you can see, I hope you can see, there's not quite as much coverage as there is when I really went in with that denser brush over here. But it still did the job of setting the product underneath. Now for consistency purposes, I am gonna go back in and add a little bit more coverage before we go into the next step. Okay, so I've done the rest of my powder products, and I like how I really need to buff today, so I can show you that technique. This is the one that I get the questions about the most. What is buffing? When do I need to buff? Do I need to buff? What do I need to buff with? What brush do I need to buff with? Over and over and over. So buffing is a technique where at the end of all of your powder products, okay, and I say that because if you are wearing powder bronzer and powder blush, but you plan on doing a cream highlight, I would suggest buffing before you apply the cream highlight, because that brush will cling on to the cream and make it hard to complete the technique and get the finish that you want. So if you're using all powders, you don't have to worry about it. If you're using a blush and highlight that are cream, just do it after the bronzer. If you're not using any powder products, then this doesn't really pertain to that kind of makeup look. I used all powder products today. My favorite buffing powder is the Hourglass Ambient Lighting Powder. I use the shade Radiant Light because I like the warmth that it gives to the skin. Dim light is also good for me. They have ethereal light, they have diffused light, they have many different shades depending on your skin tone. This does not technically leave coverage on the skin, but if you are very, very fair, you're not going to want to pick the darkest shade. I like to use a duo fiber brush. There is absolutely no rules on what kind of brush you use. It all comes down to personal preference. I do feel like you're going to want something that has a little bit more move to it than something that is dense. I like the duo fiber because of the different sizes of the bristles. I feel like it can really get into the skin and the product and diffuse it beautifully. So that's why I choose. This is IT Cosmetics. You can only get it in a set. I will link the set. It's also the blush brush that I use every day. Highly recommend the set, but any duo fiber brush will do. So I pick up a lot of product, tap it off, and then I do not, this is the one time when I buff, okay? No stamping, no stippling. I need that buffing action to really get rid of the harsh lines. That's why I do this. I want to get rid of harsh lines that may have happened with the bronzer, blush, and highlight. I want to diffuse everything. I want to give a little bit of a filtered finish to the skin. Those are the reasons that I buff. So I am not going to be gentle. I'm not going to tap. I'm really going to get in there, okay? It should not disturb the makeup underneath other than to make it look even better. If it does, you may change brushes. You may be not putting enough bronzer, blush, and highlight on to begin with, or you may not need to buff. Not everybody does. I tend to have a little bit of a heavier hand, so I do. So I'm gonna take it, I hold it close up to the ferrule because I want that pressure, and I am just gonna go back and forth and all the way up to my cheekbone, down to my jawline, buff, buff, buff. So see how that's pretty harsh, right? See how that just diffused everything? That is why I do this step. I personally don't go back into the product and buff again if I choose to do so. I just use whatever's left on the brush. I feel like that first application of product is plenty and will do the job. I do not buff on my forehead. If I was using a matte powder, which I really have never used a matte powder to buff, but if I was, maybe I would do it on the forehead, but I do find this gives a tiny bit of a sheen to the skin, and I don't want any more sheen to my forehead. It kind of has enough on its own. So I don't typically buff on the forehead, but that is how I buff. The only powder left is a touch-up powder, and I know I talked about this one being a favorite of mine that I keep at my vanity and use almost daily, and I'm going to show you how I use this almost daily. I take my Jane Iredale Flock Sponge. I love this sponge. You could also use a powder puff if you have that. Typically, I am always shiny right here. I don't know if I don't do a good enough job applying powder to that area. I don't know. I don't have oily skin, but I do tend to shine right between my brows. So I will almost always pick up a little bit of product and press it in to that area. Do you see what it did? No more shine. I'll take whatever's left and put it kind of above my brows. If I feel like I need it in this area, I will add it just a little bit, sometimes on my chin. And I feel like that really does a lot to finish off a look, in my opinion. It's not always needed. It certainly isn't always needed when I first apply my makeup. However, throughout the day, it does wonders just to press that powder in to touch up shiny areas. You don't have to even use powder, especially if you're using this sponge. It has almost absorbent qualities to it, to where you could just press it into your skin and it will take the shine away on its own. All right, so hopefully that helped you out and answered some of the questions that I know I had in the comment section of my initial powder video on how to apply. If you have any other questions, please do let me know down in the comment section, and I'll have everything I talked about listed and linked down in the description box below. Thank y'all so much for watching. Be sure and like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos, and I hope you all go out and have a very blessed day.